Hello, and welcome to Freelance Frontiers, a weekly conversation navigating the future of flexible work. I'm Ray Hames. I'm an agency expat, a brand side leader, and a former freelancer myself. And I'm here with Nick Hammond. Hey, Nick.
How's it going?
Who is a career freelance creative turned coach. We're here to chat about both sides of the freelance relationship, and we hope that our listeners will find something in here that helps them smooth out the bumps along the way of working with and as freelancers.
And if you have any feedback, insights, questions, or would like to join us on a future episode, drop us a DM. We know more and more companies are leaning on freelancers instead of full-time hires because they offer flexibility, fractional support, and a try before you buy option that lets both parties see if the working relationship is worth committing to long-term. But the difficulty is when you're a department manager and the majority of your team is freelance, things can get hairy pretty quickly. So today we're going to be chatting about the complexities of juggling multiple freelance teams and how you as a department leader can wrangle the madness.
Definitely. So, Nick, I think that the reality is that more and more companies are, and this is kind of going to sound like a pharmaceutical ad, suffering in silence. I personally know so many department leaders, we're talking CMOs, CTOs, director level folks, that went from having dedicated full-time staff on their team, kind of whether it was pre-pandemic or just back in the day, that's how they operated. And they're now working with a real hodgepodge of a talent team, a handful of full-timers, some long-term contractors, and a mix of short-term freelance support that's kind of weaves and bobs in and out based on capacity needs, seasonal projects. And the reality is all of this change didn't happen totally overnight, going from fixed full-time teams to a much more blended team dynamic. And again, most of these department leaders have really just kind of cobbled together some systems as they've gone along and figured out, oh, we're not going to replace that full-time hire. We're going to hire 2 freelancers instead. Oh, we're shifting gears. We're going to bring on a couple contractors to see if this new initiative works before we commit to long-term hires. And it's surprising what little infrastructure there really is in place that helps manage flexible teams. I know, Nick, like you've been on a lot of project teams on the other side of the coin. You've been exposed to a lot of different companies on the spectrum. I'm so curious to hear, like, what have you witnessed?
Yeah, I think I've witnessed, a lot of exactly what you're talking about, which is cobbled together systems. And to add to that madness, it feels like a lot of this is changing day by day based on what's happening within each individual business. Some are dealing with growing pains and the others can be dealing with issues that are putting strain on their resources, not just monetarily, but also from a capacity and time perspective. And as a freelancer myself, I mainly see this showing up with lackluster SOPs that never seem to really be straightened out, or, a tech stack that gets in its own way. Like I'm going to be hitting you up from email, Slack, Trello, phone calls, Zoom calls. And it's like all of that together adds to this, environment that it can be really difficult to get any sort of footing within.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen even from day one where, somebody's hired a freelancer, they're supposed to come in and start work, and they literally can't log into systems because they don't have the right VPN access.
Mm-hmm.
And they're getting paid by the day. They have a day rate, but they're not able to be productive on day one. And that's not I can't tell you how many times I've seen something very similar to that happen over and over. And I think that it's different for companies kind of at every size and scale. But whether you're talking about exactly like communication tech stacks, whether you're talking about how you find people in the first place and like having contracts all over and where you're storing documents, to even having a, kind of annual or quarterly roadmap about what projects are on deck and where your full-time team is going to need some extra capacity or not. There's all sorts of places that you see this friction happening on a real daily basis that I think, if in the best case scenario, if companies can have some systems in place, smooth things out and let people who are currently kind of unbraiding and untangling all of that mess to be, more strategic in their contributions to the overall team, to be thinking at a higher level than just where did I store that file as it relates, to the new freelancer we hired?
Yeah, or even something as simple as like an employee directory, so that when you hit a
Absolutely.
roadblock,
Yes.
you're like,
Who
okay,
do
who
I
do I
call?
even talk to? Yeah, because it's, if you don't even have that, now you're really got the wind taken out of your sails, because you're like, not only do I not know what I'm doing, but I don't even know who to talk to figure out how to work through it,
Exactly.
So
Exactly that.
from an operational standpoint, it can also feel like some systems are more critical than others. And Ray, I know from your experience, like, how do you think about how department leaders kind of prioritize getting their SHIT together to really make their own lives easier while they're managing these freelance teams?
It's really a case of like, it's help yourself. Help yourself. I guess if you're in a department seat like
Get
that,
out of your own way.
get out of your own way. I think that I was talking to somebody. I talked to somebody the other day that was just starting to spin up kind of a flexible team model within her business, and it was very early days. But she was asking really simple questions about freelance payments. How do I know? How should I be paying people? I was like, that's a real critical question to answer,
Mm-hmm.
because as soon as in my early freelance days when I was like hiring people to do kind of one-off, hey, I need a PA for the day, I'll Venmo you. That's viable at a very small scale. But when you are a corporation and you have to be really mindful of the legal elements of bringing on 1099 talent,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really where you start, right? You've got to make sure that you are covering yourself for liability first and foremost. So the systems that you need to have in place are your contracts, having a very standardized contract format that has whether that works multi-state, needs to work in every state, needs to work for your company, of course. They're not that difficult to create. You can, if you have a legal department, they can support you, or certainly this is something that you pay a lawyer a few hours for, and that it's one and done. But having a contractor, a contract template for freelance work is where I would start. Like, above all else, make sure that you are covering your legal behind. Within those contract terms, there's probably going to be some specifics about payments as well. I think that the next piece of the real heavy hitting logistics is tax liability and employment tax. And if somebody's classified as a 1099 versus a W-2, that's another piece of the logistics. You got to make sure that you're operating within kind of state by state classification guidelines, which is a whole other conversation in ball of wax.
Absolutely.
But looking at, do you have a binding contract template in place that is a rinse and repeat format that you don't have to recreate every time you bring on a new freelancer? Do you have payment systems in place that let you pay your people on time and according to contract terms and according to the law of the land? And those, I think, are the non-negotiables. I think from there, you can start to build systems that help your department move faster. Like I was saying, department planning is one where it's like, the saying is, fail to plan, you plan to fail. It's like absolutely the case. And we've talked about this on past episodes, where planning and being thoughtful about when and where you need flex support and what they need to deliver on is going to help you get the most out of your freelance teams, set them up for success, and make sure that the entire working relationship and ecosystem is a really healthy and productive one, not one where you're saying, oh my God, I needed this thing done last week, I'm so behind schedule, and also I have half the budget that it's going to cost. That's a nasty position to put anybody in. Your freelance team that's going to try to do some work for you under budget, and you're putting yourself on the back foot as well. So I would say a system that helps you plan your capacity needs is a really great place to start. And from there, again, it's like little bits of building blocks. Knowing does your department plan call for 2 freelancers throughout the year? Or do you need 20 this quarter because you're spinning up a new initiative and it's going to be a brand new team from scratch? those plans are going to look a whole lot different, and they're going to require different systems for briefing. As we were talking about the tech stack, like if you have 2 different freelancers working for you and you're on a free version of Slack, that may be totally sufficient. But if you have a team that's working at scale on highly sensitive data initiatives, then you're going to need to make sure that everybody does have the right level of security access. They may need specific equipment, and you have to think through how are you going to facilitate getting them on board so that they can be productive members of your team and you can start maximizing their contributions from very early on. I think that's you really start with a foundation. It's a little bit like, what's the hierarchy of needs here?
Mm-hmm.
But you think about the things that would cause the most actual legal liability as your foundation, and then build on forward planning and letting that inform down, from there.
It really sounds like kind of a crawl, walk, run approach where you're
Absolutely.
really making sure that you're starting from as ground level as possible so that, the base that you're building can really support everything else on top of it. And it's interesting because I feel like that approach can bleed into so many different things, because I think in a lot of situations, everyone wants to immediately skip the crawl and walk stages and go right into running. And what happens is if you skip those, you run straight into a wall and then everything kind of comes down. So I really think that, what you're saying of starting from the ground up and going slow and making sure you have these things checked off can really, like, even though it might feel a little slower, help you in the long run.
And there's things that people will certainly get very passionate about, without having a legal, your company's lawyer breathing down your neck or your company's HR director telling you have to do something. Leaders naturally want to create like fun, great systems for their people to work within. So you think about, oh, I'll come up with a freelance review process. Oh, I'll come up with an engagement, process or, series of events to keep my freelancers close to me. And all of those things are like real nice to haves. Like I love those ideas for a lot of reasons personally, but I think that just like you said, you've got to have a foundation in place before you can start layering on those nice to haves. And at the very, highest end of a well-run machine, you want to have a system in place that lets you use your team better and better over time. So I think, like, as I was saying, kind of at the beginning of what's become like this rant, having your documents all over the place, having, multiple contract formats shoved in Google Drives places, they don't let you learn over time. How did this project, do you have a recap process in place? Do you have a repository for your data around each project that lets you know how much you spent when you did a similar project? Like most companies, that is like pie in the sky dreaming because they're all moving too fast.
Yep.
But I think that if your organization and you as a department leader are really committed to maximizing the impact of a kind of more freelance focused, flexible team model, those types of things are going to really help you become that well-run machine over time.
Yep. I couldn't agree more.
And I think that, the last thing I'd want to ask you about is systems that benefit freelancers, right? Like all of this stuff, it's like, these are all great to think about from a department hiring manager perspective. But there are so many pieces of this puzzle that people want to know about, like how whether we're talking about a review process, whether we're talking about sharing results, those types of things. Like, what would you love to see in place and as a sign for you as like a real in-demand, free agent that would say, oh, I'd actually really like to work within this system?
Well, I could list a million things, but to me, it kind of all ends up boiling down to transparency and other things that feed into that. So for me, the more I can understand how my work is affecting broader business goals and what I can help do to nudge things in a better direction, the more I feel like I thrive in that environment. So for me, I kind of work a little bit better when I'm left to do my work for a while and then resurface for clarity. So for me, that could look like, a week of being in the weeds and out of meetings and really left to kind of like grapple with some of the hard stuff and how it's showing up in the work. But then at the end of the week, coming back to some sort of formal meeting as a discussion to talk about what worked, what didn't, and why. And then kind of, like a thought partner type of situation, figure out what are some initial ideas on what could be done. And then that feeds back into the next week of allowing me to kind of dive into it and figure out, what seems to work there and what doesn't.
Yeah, definitely. Think systems that create that type of conversation and also give you room to like do your thing.
Yeah. Ultimately, I think it's kind of the trying to figure out what the balance is of enough meetings for everyone to get on the same page and know where you're going, but not so much that you're destroying the ability to actually do the work. And I think in any environment, that's always a push-pull, and you're always kind of trying to find the balance. You're never ever quite there, but that's kind of, what it's all about.
I loved that in nowhere throughout this discussion did we talk about project management software. Really, you know what I mean? We didn't talk about a to-do list. We're talking about real systems. I think that's such an interesting. I was like, oh.
Well, it's funny too, is I feel like,
is that a gap, or is that just another tool in the toolbox?
Yeah, I think for me, I've gotten a little bit, well, in the crawl walk run thing, I think you usually start with to-do list items, but I think that can quickly get a little out of control because it starts to get into the conversation of what are you actually focusing on and why is your to-do list kind of getting to a point that could be out of control. So from there, I think it usually comes to more of the philosophical approach of what are you working on and why, so that you can maintain your to-do list a little bit better in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Someday we'll talk about project management systems. The world's dying to know.
Well, awesome. I think that's about all the time we had for today. If you found this useful or not, follow us here and over on LinkedIn for more tips on how you can get the most of working with and as freelance talent. Thanks,
Chat next
Ray.
week.
Bye.